Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Unbottled. And today we're getting really local to Chicago. We're talking about the Great Lakes, which provide drinking water to 40 million people. But the lakes are being overwhelmed by plastic waste. In this episode, we will unpack what's polluting our shorelines, how microplastics are showing up in our water and our bodies, and why solutions must go far beyond individual behavior change. Joel Brammeier has spent his career fighting for one of our most vital and undervalued resources, the Great Lakes. Joel Brammeier is the president and CEO of the Alliance for the Great Lakes, the oldest independent organization in the country dedicated to protecting and restoring the Great Lakes. Under his leadership, the Alliance has become a leading voice on water policy, citizen science, and plastic pollution prevention. A lifelong Midwesterner and proud Detroiter, Joel brings deep expertise in environmental policy and an unwavering commitment to clean water for all. From organizing thousands of volunteers to shaping landmark policy efforts, he's helping turn awareness into action. Joel, welcome to Unbottled.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. So you grew up in Michigan. Mm-hmm. You went to Cass Tech. When was the first time you realized how important the Great Lakes were?
Well, I was fortunate to grow up about a mile from the Detroit River. I had some wonderful experiences early in life, but I think the foundational thing really was I had the fortune to be able to go to Lake Huron every summer for a week. My dad's family grew up in Minnesota. They were sort of a mix of farmers and church workers, and they all spread out. And this was back in the 50s and 60s, all spread out around the Midwest. And the story goes that my mom said, well, if we don't make it a point to get together at least once a year, we're never going to see each other. And so they found this spot up on Lake Huron in what's called Michigan's Thumb. Mm-hmm. And it was a very modest little sort of cabin camp, but it was on Lake Huron. And we got to go there for a week every summer, and it was just incredible. And so for the first 10 years of my life, I was kind of surrounded by extended family, swimming in the water, walking on the beach. And, of course, I didn't realize at the time that was going to be what my life's work was going to be, but it was just an incredible opportunity to have and something I'll never forget.
Amazing. I have not been up to that part of Michigan. I lived in East Lansing for a couple of years. My dad was a professor at Michigan State, but there's so much of Michigan that I have yet to explore.
Yeah, it's something like, I might get this wrong, but it's like the second most shoreline in the country, except for Alaska, something like that. Michigan has an astonishing amount of waterfront. So it's great to visit just about any part of the state.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm in Chicago, but I am still a Michigander at heart, I've got to admit. So probably was obvious.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, Michigan has a lot to be proud of. And my colleague, Allie Rose, our director of marketing, is also from Michigan, born and raised, so we get to talk a lot about how cool Michigan is. Yep. So what I wanted to dig into, you started sharing with us a little bit of who you are, but tell us more also about your journey and what got you to where you are today.
Well, I had a lot of people in this environmental space have stories like this, like the one I just shared about going to Lake Huron. I had just a lot of great outdoor experiences when I was younger. Speaking of family being spread out, I had family members in Anchorage, Alaska.
Awesome.
And so I got to visit them a couple times in high school, and my uncle took me on a sort of mini backcountry hike out in the mountains. And it was my first time that I felt really out there, really alone. You're in bear country, and it was just sort of like, wow, this is incredible. The scale of things up there, the landscapes. So that, the Great Lakes experiences, all of that just, I think, steered me towards wanting to get into the environmental world as a career. And so while I didn't have a clear idea of what I wanted to do, I went to college for biology, chemistry, which I didn't do quite as well in, and then, grad school for environmental science and policy. And it all just kind of, was steering me towards this desire to do something for the natural environment. And if I'm being honest, I grew up in kind of a family that was more service oriented, right? Mm-hmm. My dad was a pastor. My mom, she was a homemaker, but then she was a teacher. And it felt like, here's another way that I can do something with my life that gives back, right, to my community. And so all that led me to, eventually I moved to Chicago and started volunteering with a few groups and got involved with one that was really focused on Lake Michigan. And, and here we are 25 years later in what seems like the blink of an eye. But yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to just having those opportunities to enjoy and feel like part of the natural world when I was younger.
Incredible.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, when they look toward the Midwest, maybe don't consider all the ways that nature and the environment is so present. I mean, yes, people joke Chicago is windy and cold, but really there's so many types of activities throughout the year, depending on what the season is. And I'm curious, when you got to Chicago, was that because it was the kind of hub of environmental activity at the time, or just the biggest city with the most kind of jobs available?
If I'm being honest, the reason I moved here is because my girlfriend, who is now my wife, lived here.
Okay.
So yeah, that's the main reason. Very mundane, nothing to do with career. But I was fortunate to find, a community of people and organizations that were very into this work. I didn't know this at the time. Remember, I was young. I didn't really know what I was going to do for a career. But I didn't know that, for example, US EPA's regional office is located in Chicago, right? So there's sort of an ecosystem, so to speak, around that.
Mm-hmm.
There are huge environmental efforts to protect public lands in Chicago, right? Both government and non-government. We've got the forest preserve districts. You've got organizations dedicated to the river, dedicated to the parks. There is this like green and blue ecosystem in Chicago that has only gotten bigger since then. But that was... there was a foundational effort at the time called Chicago Wilderness that was all about figuring out how do you bring nature, restore nature back into urban and suburban areas, protect what we have, but then bring it back to some of these great places that Chicagoans can enjoy. And that organization has continued. But so all this stuff was going on that I certainly wasn't aware of when I moved to Chicago, but it allowed me to quickly kind of get engaged in the green and blue spaces, right? And then eventually found an entry-level position, and here we are.
And was that entry-level position with Alliance for the Great Lakes?
It was with its predecessor organization called the Lake Michigan Federation. So that group had started in 1970 as a group that was really tried to be a banding together of communities around Lake Michigan to protect clean water, right? So this was the same time. I would say dozens, if not hundreds, of similar kinds of groups were launching across the U.S. This is when the major federal legislation was being passed, like the Clean Water Act. There was sort of this rise of organized environmentalism. So the Lake Michigan Federation was one of those groups, and they did things like helped to inform the first what's called the Water Quality Agreement with Canada, and they did a lot of work on nuclear power development, which was big at the time in the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
And then that group just kind of evolved and changed over the years, eventually became the Alliance for the Great Lakes.
Amazing. Well, tell us, what is the Alliance for the Great Lakes? Sure. And you've told us a little bit about how you got involved, but maybe walk us through the evolution of the organization.
Sure. So from that small sort of community-based group back in 1970, it had its ups and downs like any organization does. And it became, it's really started to, I think, get its legs under it again in the late 90s. I joined the organization in the early 2000s, and it was still dedicated to the health of Lake Michigan. My early work was around trying to figure out how to restore habitats and natural areas in coastal Lake Michigan, especially in the southern part. So places like the Chicago shoreline, Northwest Indiana, Southeast Chicago. And then it became the Alliance for the Great Lakes in 2005, right? And the director at the time kind of worked with the board to say, we need an independent regional Great Lakes organization that's going to advocate for the policies, practices, and funding that are needed to protect this incredible, unmatched source of fresh water. And so since 2005, we've been growing. I became the director or the president in 2010. I've been growing since then. And we're all about advocating for the Great Lakes, supporting the research and analysis that allows us to understand what's going on in the lakes, and then educating people and getting them engaged in action that they can take to protect our water. And it's honestly such a wonderful cause to be part of, because it is, I genuinely believe it's unifying. Like politics these days, even in the environmental space, can be fractious, obviously very polarized. Unfortunately, climate change has become a real polarized issue, as urgent as that is. Water is something that historically, and I think still today, has the potential to bring people together, because that concept of, one, these waters are special, they're globally unique, and they're kind of our, competitive advantage, if you want to say, for the Midwest.
Yep.
And there's something everybody needs, right?
Yep.
Safe and clean water is something everybody needs and can agree on. And so once you kind of get into that conversation, it brings people together in a way that makes the work that we do really satisfying, and where I can see a lot of potential.
Absolutely. Yeah, water, good quality water is something that is universally desired, and understood as important.
And unfortunately, not universally had by everyone.
Yes.
And that's something that a big part of what we work on is recognizing that because people feel so strongly that safe and clean water is something everybody should have, we can point out where that's not happening, right? And then talk about how we're going to fix that and how we're going to do it in a way that addresses community needs across our region.
Yep, absolutely. I don't want to divert the conversation too much into that topic, but the Midwest has had its share of negative headlines around water quality. Here in Chicago, we have lead pipe issues. We know about Flint, Michigan. If you could wave a magic wand and there was one policy change that you could make today to help improve access to safe drinking water for everybody in the region, what might that one thing be?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question, but I do think that if I could wave a magic wand and have every home and business have their sort of plumbing upgraded that's supplying their residents or their place of business, so that we knew that the water from the source to the tap was actually safe and clean for everybody, that's what I would do. Because it's not, obviously, like, we can keep the Great Lakes very, very clean, but if that water doesn't get to people in a healthy way, right. Then we're falling down on the job. And so but then once you have that, right, then you've got this positive relationship with your drinking water, right? You know where it's coming from. You're able to access it. You are able to afford it because we've structured all of our sort of utilities in the right way. And now you can talk about how much you value that resource in a lot of other ways. But if you don't have safe drinking water, it's almost impossible to think about anything else.
100%. Yeah, I if I had a magic wand, I would probably do the same thing. And to break it down, maybe for the listeners who aren't as familiar with municipal water systems, and you can correct me, but my understanding is, right, you've got municipal water treatment facilities that are bringing water, here in Chicago at least, from Lake Michigan, and we're treating and cleaning the water to a regulated standard.
Right.
Then it goes back out through a main line, which at that point, the water remains good quality. And the problem then that you're isolating is that when it goes from the main and transitions to the service lines, which are more of like the local branches, right, off of the trunk of the tree that go to each house or apartment building, right? And that's where the problem has been identified. Yeah.
So just like if you're driving down a street in Chicago or any city, right, and there's side streets that branch off to go in a different direction, imagine that street is a pipe and it's carrying your drinking water, and there's side streets going off to each building, right? And so each building gets its water supply through an individual pipe. And for many, many decades, the pipes that were used to move that water into the individual buildings was made of lead. For a variety of plumbing reasons. Unfortunately, Chicago kept that practice going until the mid-'80s.
Right, we were the last city.
last major city to allow lead to be used as service lines. And but many other places in the Midwest and the Northeast part of the country have many, many lead service lines. And so these are not, they're maintained in a way where the water coming through them should be safe most of the time. But unfortunately, human error, corrosion, age, just things wearing out, you're basically, you've got an unsafe pipe that has been managed to try to keep it safe for many decades. And now we're shifting as a country to getting those pipes out of the ground, replacing them with safe plumbing, so we don't have to think about the potential risk and liability that those pipes pose to people's health, which we've learned, unfortunately, all too well from the Flint water crisis and from many other communities that have had to take emergency action to get those pipes replaced. Right.
And also for the audience awareness, and you have the biology training.
A little bit.
But my understanding, right, is that lead, obviously unsafe for human consumption, especially younger people and elderly, right? When your brain and your body is most susceptible to chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
But lead is filterable.
Yeah.
Right? It's not something like we can talk about other contaminants and toxins, which we will get into, like plastic pollution. But lead you can filter.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is the upside of lead.
Yeah, and there are a number of like home filtration technologies you can use to get lead out and other contaminants out of your water. I think it's important to note that most of the time, most of the water coming into your house is very clean,
Yep.
right? And so it's something we really want to promote. I think it's important that we promote the use of safe and clean drinking water from the tap,
Yep.
because like not just for the Great Lakes region, but for everybody, because it's a basic need. It's a human right to
Yep.
be able to access that water. But filtration is a good extra step to make sure that you're safe. You can get your tap water tested for contaminants.
Yep. City of Chicago, you can get a
City
free
does a
kit sent to
complimentary.
your house. Yep.
You want to test for more chemicals, you can buy a kit at Home Depot or online that can test for more stuff, and you can pay a little bit to have that done. So
Yep.
you can figure that out. If you live in a rural area, you can have your well tested, and a whole bunch of other contamination issues there. But
Yep.
but ultimately, it's just really important that people can rely on this shared public infrastructure we have for the basic need that is safe and clean drinking water.
100%. Yeah. This is a great resource for everybody. And if we all invest in it and trust it and use it, then the system in general will continue to support that usage, right? Our tax dollars are going to clean our water.
Right. And a big part is we want to make sure the water is clean at the source and at the tap.
Right.
And we have, fallen down on both counts in some cases in the Great Lakes.
Yep, absolutely. But, I think one of the messages to your point is like most of the time you can trust your tap water.
Yeah.
Get it tested. The challenge is most of the time isn't 100%.
Right. Especially for people who are vulnerable, especially younger people, like you said.
Younger people, certain neighborhoods and communities in the city of Chicago where, for whatever reason, the lead pipes have not yet been replaced or people are not yet using at-home filtration systems. But there are readily available products and solutions. You can install an under-the-sink filter. You can use a regular pitcher with a filtration on it to eliminate the lead. So this isn't an impossible problem. And I'll mention Kadeya, right? What we've said is while we wait for the lead pipes, the service lines to be replaced, Kadeya is filtering your lead and a lot of other things as well. And you can get great quality tap water, Lake Michigan's finest right here. So I just want to reinforce that the tap is great. And to get that extra, 1 or 2 percentage points to 100%, there are solutions.
And it's really important on that point about how, some neighborhoods, whether it's a whole city or whether it's a neighborhood within a large city like Chicago, unfortunately do have higher rates, more elevated rates of contaminants like lead or like lower rates of lead service line replacement. And it's really critical to recognize that, because often, unfortunately, that tracks with communities that have experienced historic discrimination and disinvestment based on race, based on income. And that has to be addressed in the immediately by providing filtration, making sure people can get that safe drinking water they need in their homes. And then by speeding up things like replacing lead service lines, which unfortunately we're on a very long timeline for doing that. Certainly in Chicago, the longest, and then even in other cities, longer than it should be. And so that's an urgent need that we have to address. Yep,
absolutely. Yeah, we're 100% aligned on this issue. Making sure everyone has great quality tap water. Great. So this is actually then an interesting transition because we're going to start talking a little bit about plastic pollution, which is something that your alliance really works on and has been a great leader in the region. So I'm curious, why are you focusing on plastic pollution as a core issue?
Well, again, as we talked about earlier, we've been around for more than 5 decades. And for a big chunk of that time, we've had a program called Adopt a Beach. And so Adopt a Beach is exactly what it sounds like. People go out and, choose a piece of shoreline, they clean it up, they bring bags, they bring buckets, they bring gloves, and they find unimaginable amounts of stuff
Yep.
on our Great Lakes shorelines, right? So it's a great way for people to get involved in like a direct hands-on cleanup of the lakes and of the beaches or the park or wherever they are. And it's also led us to analyze what we're finding, right? And so those volunteers all collect data on what they're finding on the beach or on the shoreline, wherever they are. And we published a report last year that showed that over 20 years, about 86% of the items being found by our volunteers are plastic. And so this tracks with what we're hearing from researchers that there was a big sort of explosion of research in the Great Lakes that started in the early 2010s around plastics. And it tracks with what they're seeing as well. So we kind of came to the plastics issue through our volunteers, and we heard and saw from them that all of this stuff was being found on the beaches. And these are not just things that are being left behind on the shoreline by beachgoers. Some of it's coming in from rivers, some of it's being washed up on the shoreline. It's coming from everywhere.
Yep.
And it was sort of like, we're not going to solve the Great Lakes plastic problem simply by picking up plastic on the shoreline, but
Right.
it is showing us what's happening on the land, in the water. And that's led us to a whole bunch of interesting sort of sets of research, and also, questions about what policies and changes and practices are needed to keep that stuff out of the water. Because unfortunately, as we started learning in the early 2010s, plastics in the Great Lakes are throughout our waters, and it's a big problem.
Yeah. So I just want to underscore some of the stats that you referenced. 86% of litter collected on Great Lakes beaches is composed either partially or fully of plastic, according to a report that your Alliance for the Great Lakes recently released. This report is based on 20 years of data collected from more than 14,000 adopt-a-beach cleanups across all 5 Great Lakes. That's astounding. What items show up most often? And what can that tell us about those upstream systems and where the problems, the gaps lie?
Yeah, so the vast majority by number, like of count, are either whole or partial plastic food containers. And that could be anything from a bottle to a styrofoam package to a wrapper to anything you can think of comes in plastic. And so a lot of that 86% is made up of pieces of plastic that have broken off of what was a larger piece of plastic that was often a single-use food container. Might have been, sometimes you get places that have a lot of straws, a lot of cigarette butts. People don't realize that, cigarette butts are actually made of plastic, take a very long time to decompose. And so, but that's the majority. And then occasionally you find the big chunks of something, but so much of it are these bits of tiny trash that are these plastics breaking down in the environment. And as I said, they're coming from all over. And unfortunately, our volunteers, occasionally they'll go out to a beach. And if you go to a big Great Lakes beach and you see the vast water and the vast sand, and you look at it and you might say, well, this is really clean. And then when they start actually looking and moving their hands and their feet through the sand, you start to see these little bits of plastic, and they realize how much is actually being deposited and how quickly it's breaking down into these tiny particles.
Right.
And that kind of shows off that scale of the problem.
Yeah. From the report also, we're seeing, right, that, to your point, the majority of these plastics polluting the marine environment originate from terrestrial sources, right?
Yes.
So we here on land, what we're doing here, right, somehow is ending up in the water.
Yeah, and so that's a really important distinction for Great Lakes plastic, because ocean plastics, of course, has been sort of a prominent issue in the environmental world.
Right.
And, in the National Geographic documentaries, people see it on their screens. They see fishing nets or lines, ropes, right? And all this stuff in the Pacific garbage patch, or these places, there's other patches, by the way, it's not just the Pacific, but they see these sort of the remnants of stuff that's coming from marine sources. And here in the Great Lakes, the reality is, as you said, most of the plastic in our lakes is actually coming from the land. It's coming from us, right? So it might be single-use food packaging. It can be automotive waste, so stuff that actually wears off tires. It comes from our laundry. Unfortunately, synthetic fabrics that that water that gets discharged into our drains
Yep.
is a huge source of microplastics. So we are actually, as a system here in the Great Lakes, people are actually putting that plastic into the water. It's not coming from, boats and commercial fishing or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really critical to think about and understand. So there was also a study from 2021 called The Impact of Microplastics and Nanoplastics on Human Health. And they're talking about the microplastics that you've started, alluding to and introducing. And the way that study defined microplastics is plastic waste that, once disposed of, is exposed to biological, chemical, and environmental elements and will break down into huge amounts of microplastics. And a microplastic is smaller than 5 millimeters.
Right.
And nanoplastics are smaller than 0.1 nanometers.
Right.
So getting very small, sometimes not visible. I mean, generally not visible
Those
to
are
the naked
definitely
eye.
not yeah.
So you've talked a little bit about where they're coming from and, a little bit of that moment where it's entered the waterways and starts breaking down. Can you share, let's go a little upstream and then we'll go a little downstream again. So a little upstream, do you have a sense of where that plastic waste is coming from? How is that, food packaging ultimately going from a garbage can that someone did their best and put the garbage into that can? How is that then waste somehow ending up in the water?
A lot of waste, of course, if somebody puts something in the garbage can, that garbage gets taken properly and taken to a landfill and landfilled, that waste is not going into our water. But unfortunately, there's a lot of plastic that doesn't get captured. It gets thrown on the streets, sidewalks, lands, in a whole variety of ways. And a lot of that plastic actually washes into our stormwater drains, right? And those drains can often allow plastic to move directly into our rivers, which eventually drain into the Great Lakes. So that's one big source, is sort of surface litter, surface debris that washes into the water.
So that's why it's important you put your trash in a trash can.
Not littering is still really important, right? And then there is what I'll call direct deposit, right? There's the direct deposit of waste on the beach, on the shoreline.
Yep.
That is part of it as well, right? And we find that when our volunteers go out. Other big parts, though, are upstream. As I mentioned earlier, synthetic fabrics. So synthetic fabrics, which we all use and rely on, shed bits of microplastic when they're washed. And so that microplastic goes into the drain hose coming out of your laundry machine, goes to a wastewater treatment plant. And unfortunately, wastewater treatment doesn't pull out all those microplastics. So they get discharged right back out.
Those are very small, right? Those are even the nanoplastics.
Can be nanoplastics. And so that's another big source of plastic going into our water.
And can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
Just synthetic, right? You can easily identify if your clothes are synthetic. You look at the clothing label, and basically if it's not cotton or wool or any material that comes from natural sources, if it says polyester or rayon,
it's going to be shedding synthetic fibers.
It's going to be every time you wash it. Yep. And probably even every time you wear it, right? As you move around, it's kind of shedding little bits as you move around.
Yeah. And there are emerging technologies that are able to filter that out of the waste stream coming out of laundry machines. And my hope is that becomes standard practice sooner than later. Industry is looking at that, and it's a known issue and one that we can get a handle on. I mentioned this earlier, automotive waste. So wear from tires is another big source of microplastics. And, of course, that's something that we all rely on transportation to get places, right? So there are some big macro sources. There is a big success story. Micro beads, which were these sort of small plastic beads in cosmetic products and some prescribed products, but mostly in cosmetic products, were very common until the early 2010s, when the research kind of community in the Great Lakes really started looking for this stuff. And they found out that a huge portion of what the plastics that they were finding in the water were actually these cosmetic microbeads. And that did something that rarely happens that led to a national ban on those
pretty
plastic
quickly,
microwaves
right?
within like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And so we're really proud of that. That was a great step. So there are success stories, but a lot of sort of the low-hanging fruit on this has been taken out, and now we're into these big systems where they are, just by existing, we're moving plastic into our waters every day, not because the consumer is a bad person, but because a lot of some of the systems we rely on are shedding plastic all the time, and that's where we've got to get a sort of a handle on reducing the sources that we can.
Yep. Thank you for walking us through that. Yeah. So that was a bit upstream. And then can you talk us through now in more detail what you started sharing about the breakdown of these plastics and what's happening in the natural environment?
So I'll start by saying that the commonly cited stat is the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York estimates that about 22 million pounds of plastic is going into the Great Lakes every year, right? So like an astonishing amount.
Yep.
Not surprisingly, a lot of that input is concentrated in large metro areas, right? Places where we don't always like to think about this, but the water cycle means we use water, we sort of get rid of it. It gets treated so it's cleaner, and then it gets discharged back into our rivers, which feed our lakes, right? So that treated sewage does go back into the Great Lakes. And so you see these concentrations in cities along the shoreline of big kind of sources of plastics in the water. So anywhere, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Toledo, Buffalo, you're going to see higher concentrations. When those particles, whether it's coming in from a sewage plant or from a stormwater drain or whatever it is, our Great Lakes are super dynamic, right? They are forceful living systems, which means there's wind, there's waves, there's ultraviolet light, and all that stuff weathers down and wears down the plastic that's going in. And so what happens very quickly, more quickly than you might think, is once a piece of plastic hits a Great Lake, it is already breaking down into smaller and smaller particles. And so, that you're going to have, you might have a piece of food packaging, you might have plastics that are coming out of laundry fibers, and they are being kind of worked over by the lake's environment to become smaller and smaller, to the point where, you can't go out into the lake and expect to be able to clean them up because they're now all these tiny particles. And so now we're faced with Great Lakes, which are of course, home to fish and wildlife and just sort of a natural ecosystem that we all love. And they're our source of drinking water, right? And so they're kind of filled with these plastic particles, especially near the places where most people live. Right. And that's the situation we're in today because we've sort of allowed this volume of plastic to continue being deposited into the lakes. And again, because we just started to get a handle on the research community, just started to get a handle on what's happening here. Now we're facing down, well, what do we do about this?
Fascinating. When you start thinking about this at scale, happening over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So why should people care?
Yeah. Well, I think one, there's just a visceral human reaction. We shouldn't be dumping stuff in the lake. Right? Yep. And that's whether it's plastic or coal ash or sewage or whatever it is. People understand that the lakes are our source of drinking water. They're vital to our economy. They're a source of natural wonder and beauty and health.
Yep.
And we shouldn't be dumping things in them. So that's a good start, right?
Yep.
But people should care also because let's start with the critters. Fish and wildlife are consuming plastic because they're mistaking it for food. And, we have lots of organisms that just, their whole body design is to sort of filter food out of the water or gulp down water, and whatever particles are in it is what they eat.
Right.
So you're starting to find fish with large amounts of plastic in their stomachs. But even more concerning than that to me is that we're seeing a lot of evidence of how plastic particles can move through the human body.
Right.
And so we have, and we can talk a bit about sort of specific research, but we are taking in a good volume of plastic every day simply by drinking water, by breathing, in the food that we eat, and so you're seeing humans actually ingesting this stuff. And one thing we can control is kind of what's in our drinking water, right? So that's a place where we can focus on how do we make sure that we're not bringing plastic into our bodies, in our drinking water? So I think people should be concerned for a whole lot of reasons, and ultimately, it's I want to point out that it's not a sustainable system, right? We're using a product often one time that is being created from petroleum that we're digging out of the ground. It gets thrown away, and particles of it go back into our drinking water
and never break down.
Never break down. It keeps circulating through our ecosystems, through our bodies, and so that it is a system that is not healthy or sustainable, and we have to figure out how we can do better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that was very well articulated. So we could start to think a little bit more about the policies that are available to us and how we might start solving this unsustainable situation that we're in. So I wanted to transition a little bit and talk about extended producer responsibility, or EPR. And the reason why I'm going to make that jump straight away from talking about the problem to a specific solution is that you've mentioned that this is a systems problem. So we have to think about solving it in a systemic fashion. And then also, I think we haven't explicitly said this, but what we really want to do, right, if you have a leaky bucket, the first thing you want to do is close up that hole before you start refilling the bucket. So we want to close up that hole, right? We want to solve the problem at the source or the tap, so to speak. So can you tell us what is EPR and how does it work in practice?
Sure. So before I talk about EPR, I will just sort of step back and talk about that systems part of this conversation.
Yeah, thanks.
So we are, as people, like as humans in the world, we rely on certain things to be able to live, right? And so once we all rely on that, right, it becomes part of our system. And we, for better or for worse, we rely on plastics. We have a couple of our staff members at the Alliance a few years ago did a project where they went trying to go a week without plastic.
Yeah.
It is incredibly difficult to do that.
Incredibly.
Right. And so plastics play a huge role in so much of what people do every single day. And once something becomes sort of that integrated into our society, into who we are and how we live, you can't expect the individual consumer to be able to somehow solve this big systems problem by throwing a bottle into a recycling can. It doesn't work that way.
Right, you're swimming upstream.
Exactly.
And the stream is stronger than you.
Yeah, and the stream of plastic waste, unfortunately, is stronger than you as an individual. So do the individual thing, be responsible, put your stuff in the recycling, even though we know that a lot of it doesn't get recycled. Do your best and recognize that we have to address this at the systems, at the collective level, in order for us to have an impact. And that's where we get down to source reduction and tools like EPR, or extended producer responsibility.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that instead of saying, you, Joel, you drink out of your single-use plastic water bottle, which I try not to do, and then you throw it in the recycling, that's not the solution. The solution is to produce less plastic.
Yep.
Find technologies and methods and processes that allow us to capture more of it so it doesn't go into the water, and have smart regulation that ensures that those things actually happen, right? And so extended producer responsibility, or what's commonly called EPR, is simply acknowledging that we rely on plastics as a society, and we're not going to solve the plastic pollution problem by individual action alone, right? We need companies that are producing plastic to actually take responsibility and accountability for the entire life cycle. So that could mean things like, let's knock out some of the plastics that we know are going to be impossible to recycle, like polystyrene, styrofoam, single-use styrofoam, right? Let's set goals and reduce the amount of plastic that's being produced of other kinds, right? So thinner packaging, more refillable bottles, that kind of thing, so reduce. Then you can also have, of course, it takes money, right? So part of it is, let's have the companies pay into a fund that then can support research, can support improvement of innovation that allows companies to hit the metrics that they need to for reduction, and helps to support the systems that are needed to capture all this plastic. And importantly, finally, we have to have regulation. You have to have oversight and accountability for all this to work, because we're a volunteer-based organization at the Alliance,
Wow.
but voluntary action doesn't solve huge system problems alone, right? You have to have accountability. And so that's a really important part of EPR as well.
Yeah. Wanted to, again, take another step back. Thank you for kind of giving us that broader context of the systems challenge. And maybe I jumped straight into EPR a little too quickly, but wanted to actually take that step back to say, well, can you talk to us about what's happening across the United States and the Great Lakes region when it comes to policy? So maybe you can give us a menu of what are some of the policies that you're seeing that are trying to address the systems problem.
Yeah. So there is, I'll say at the outset, ideally there would be in the U.S. a federal approach to extended producer responsibility. That's unlikely to happen soon for a lot of reasons.
Yep.
But the states are starting to take the lead. And what we've seen historically in the Great Lakes is that sometimes the states step out and do things first because the federal action isn't happening enough. In this issue, California has taken a leadership role in extended producer responsibility with a really solid approach. By the way, EPR can be kind of fashioned in lots of different ways, right? And some work better than others. Some are more accountable than others. California's approach is reasonably good. Colorado
EPR is a toolkit. It's a framework, and then you pick and choose how you're going to apply it and implement it.
Right, and you can do some pieces, to start, and then you can add other pieces as you go. It doesn't always all happen at once. Colorado's approach is a little bit of a lighter touch than California's, so maybe not as aggressive. Minnesota is the first and only Great Lakes state to have passed an EPR bill.
Yep.
That was last year, which is great.
Yep. I think they're the 7th state.
In
the country.
I think that's right. And so I named a few, but there are other states that have also passed those bills. And then you see other parts of what could become parts of EPR percolating in some of the Great Lakes states. Here in the state of Illinois, where I live, there was a big effort this year because kind of a small win last year where we eliminated the use of disposable plastic cosmetic bottles in hotels, right? So those are gone. That's good. There was a big effort this year to try to ban single-use polystyrene or styrofoam, right? Which is this plastic that is basically impossible to recycle. And that got very close to passing in Illinois. It just fell a few votes short in the Illinois Senate, which is a loss, but it was a big deal that it got as far as it did, right? So there's this recognition that we can't keep pumping this stuff out and using something we don't really need because we're never going to be able to get rid of it.
And it's also incredibly toxic, right? That has been shown over and over and over again.
And we should come back to that whole thing of toxicity in production and in the actual microplastics. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, though, is, from the state I grew up in, Michigan, which has long had a 10-cent deposit on single-use soda bottles, where you pay your 10 cents when you buy it, and then you get your 10 cents back when you return it. And now they're trying to expand that to include more beverage containers, right? So things like plastic water bottles, where it's only been soda and beer now, because obviously a lot more drinks get packaged than just soda and beer now in 2025, trying to expand that so it serves its purpose of really keeping that waste out of our stormwater, out of our rivers and lakes. So there's efforts like that too. And I think the thing with EPR is it's cliche, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
Like, you can do it in pieces and you can make good progress, but you got to keep at it, because ultimately this has to lead to ideally a national approach where producers are reducing the amount of plastic that they're producing, and they are supporting and funding the efforts to keep that plastic out of our environment.
Yeah. So when you were talking a little bit earlier about, the kind of big goals that we want to accomplish when you're trying to solve this systems problem, right?
Yeah.
You talked about regulation, which we're starting to discuss. You talked about reducing this at the source, and you talked about having a little bit of actually, what was it? There was a third element of what you've described that I thought was really great.
Right. So what I sort of EPR, I sort of categorize it as reduce, and then you've got your funding and research, and then you've got your accountability and regulation, right?
Right.
And so reducing, it could be eliminating certain products like styrofoam. It could be things like moving to refillables, right? So instead of every time you buy a bottle of cleaner of some kind, you buy one bottle, and then after that, you buy small bottles of concentrate, right?
Yeah,
and
or tablets, powder tablets that you mix at home.
And so it doesn't have to be all or nothing. We're using a smaller amount of plastic every time we buy that refillable, right? And that can make a big impact, right? If it's done systemically.
Right.
Research and funding, you've got to have companies that produce plastic pay into a fund which supports research on reduction technologies, can support improvements in recycling and reclamation, all the tools that are needed for the sort of private sector as a community to take responsibility for keeping the waste out of our waters. And then the last thing, of course, is accountability, regulation, right? And acknowledging that, government has to be able to do its job of making sure that all these other steps are actually happening, right? Because we've seen time and time again that just, volunteering and good intentions are a place where things start, but that's not what actually ensures that our water stays healthy.
Right, because you need people for whom this isn't a passion project to also be part of this broader system and
make it part of their business, right?
Yeah.
And to make it, and honestly, to make it profitable, which it totally can be.
Yeah. So I wanted to thank you for reviewing those 3 key points. I wanted to talk, it's kind of a 2-point conversation. One is if we can talk a little bit about this idea that somehow we're adding regulation where previously there was nothing. Like this idea that, and I think we're contending with this in the United States right now, like, oh, it's big government, they regulate everything, it slows business down. I want to talk a little bit about exactly what you just left off saying. Actually, it could be profitable. So how do we create this approach that actually doesn't just generate more costs and slow business down, but can actually propel business forward and create great opportunities and economic growth? And then the other point is to say, actually, whether it's this 10-cent bottle bill or it's this like recycling choreography that we're all, dancing through and pretending, talking about how there is actually stuff that's happening today. It's just not effective. I want to address this assumption that by adding EPR, we're creating a slower, more regulated environment than what we have today.
I think I'll just say at the outset, by adding EPR, you are giving the private sector an opportunity to step up and show to their consumers that they are doing the work of taking care of the environment around them, right? And I think that
and not just the environment, but like the functioning of a city.
Yeah, the functioning of a city. And I think that is, again, it's not an all or nothing approach, right? We have to acknowledge, again, plastic plays a central part in our lives in a way that we can't get away from. And smart companies are going to understand that and figure out how they can reduce the amount they're producing, reduce the amounts being consumed, and still provide a great product that people want to use.
Provide a great product where they can bring down their bottom line.
Yeah.
They increase their top line and hopefully generate more engagement, more trust, more loyalty.
I think all of that is entirely possible, yes. And I think a lot of consumers are demanding that sort of activity, that sort of action by the companies that they're purchasing from. Now, let me say about the whole big government thing. I think the easiest way to counter that, I was just thinking of the other day, I ride my bike in the city of Chicago a lot, and I did a little fitness ride down to Northerly Island, which is a small peninsula sticking out into Lake Michigan off downtown Chicago. All the way out at the end, it's about a mile long, and you're sort of out a little bit out there, as far out there in the way that you can be in the city. And I got to the end of this peninsula, and I looked around me, and there were like dozens of plastic bottles washed up, and this is like kind of an out there place onto this little peninsula sticking out, and it's like you just can't get away from it.
Yep.
And so anybody who talks about big government, I would say look at that and ask yourself, well, how is this going to be fixed? Are you going to pick it up personally? No. Do you think the taxpayers who support the Chicago Park District should have to pay for the Park District to come out and clean it up? No. right? So there's a different answer, right? We've got to get away from that idea. And I think that's fairly easy to break down because people, again, one of the reasons we're engaged in plastic is because it's so visible and visceral. People see it, they feel it, they understand.
Versus
this
carbon
shouldn't
emissions.
be here.
You can't see carbon emissions.
You can't see carbon. You can see the impacts, but it's like plastic you can see. And so I think that kind of gets over that hump pretty quickly. When people see the waste in the environment and they recognize, just because I'm a taxpayer, I shouldn't have to pay for the cleanup costs of all this, right? And so I think that's good as long as we have companies that can acknowledge that a mixture of voluntary and funding and regulatory action is needed to solve the problem. And I think we are getting there. You've actually had some. I've heard, like, just to give one example, they're kind of famous for it. SC Johnson has gone out publicly and called for regulation, and of course they want to be profitable, but they've also recognized that plastic reduction is a global imperative, right? And you've got to figure out how to get to a sort of regulatory certainty. And that's one of the things that companies want. That is, it's not that they don't want to be regulated, it's that they want regulatory certainty. And so when you see
they want a level playing field for every company.
Yeah. And so when you see
all
an
my
issue like
competitors
this,
are going to be dealing with the same. We're playing by the same rules.
Right.
We're playing the game by the same rules. Give me the rules so I can go back to playing the game.
Right. And so smart companies see this on the horizon. They understand that this is a global problem. But we're talking about the Great Lakes today. Even in the Great Lakes, they see how this stuff is showing up in our waters. And the smart companies are saying, okay, we see that something's got to change, right? We're going to have to change the way we produce, change our business model to accommodate our responsibility for keeping this stuff out of our waters, right? So how are we going to do that? How are we going to set that level playing field and make sure that happens? That's kind of where we're in, that kind of messy part right now.
Yep.
But I think that's happened with other pollutants and contaminants in the past. It's going to be happening with consumer plastics here very soon.
Yeah. Thank you for making that so clear. It's kind of like, on the one hand, we can have that plastic pollution that we see in our public lands and in parks and in our drinking water and in our food, and we resent it, and we're paying for it anyway with our taxpayer dollars to somehow figure out how to manage it not effectively. And we're getting mad at these brands, right? These companies that we like their products, but we're mad that they're not solving the problem. Or on the other hand, you could have something like an EPR where now you have a level playing field. The companies are all playing by the same rules. They're now incentivized equally to generate new business models or new technologies and materials. They get to build better relationship with their consumer. And now it's not just the taxpayer all of a sudden having to pay for this externality that nobody has wanted to deal with.
Yeah.
So it seems like a great solution, right? Everybody can win.
Everybody can win. And I'm glad you brought up that point about how we handle externalities, because one of the problems with plastic and the reason it's gotten to this point is that, unfortunately, plastic, after it's been used for whatever purpose it was manufactured for, it has very little value. Right. This is one of the reasons we don't see recycling being terribly effective at reducing plastic in the environment, is because there just isn't very much demand for a product that is almost free. Right. It just doesn't have a lot of value. You contrast that with something, let's say, I'm from Detroit, so let's contrast that with a car. Right. If you're a good car driver and you drive your car to 200,000 miles and you get the absolute most out of it, you still don't just dump it in a lake when you're done, right? There's value to some of the materials in that. They can be reclaimed, they can be used by somebody else. That natural incentive isn't there with plastic waste. And so we've got to figure out how to add it. And that's what EPR is all about. It's like saying, we're going to make sure that the process of creating plastic waste has some value, right? So companies can plan around it and they can figure out how to make their control of that plastic waste profitable in a way that's just not possible right now, because again, that waste just isn't worth much. And so there's no natural incentive to reclaim it and do something with it that keeps it out of the environment. Yeah.
We've talked around the specifics of the EPR. We've kind of defined it at a high level. And then we've talked a bit about what the market and regulatory and social benefits might be. I know that state by state EPR gets defined differently, and as you've said, also it's a toolkit that can evolve and add more layers.
Yeah.
Let's try, without getting too much into like wonky policy stuff.
Sure.
Let's try to maybe outline like what are the 3 or 4 key features of EPR. Like what's that high level starting point before the states begin adding their unique touch and ingredients?
Sure. Well, if you, we can go into those components in a bit more depth, right? So let's say I talked about those, I was kind of talking about 3 components earlier. The first is like, eliminate the worst and kind of reduce production, right? So you can do things like let's say as part of our EPR, this state is going to stop manufacturing styrofoam, single-use styrofoam. Like we're just going to stop doing that because it's impossible to recycle. We're also going to set a goal of, let's say, 50% reduction for single-use plastic packaging, right? So that would be something like, let's say, water bottles or cleaner bottles or whatever it is, has to use 50% less plastic by X date, right?
Yep.
That could be another way to approach that. So the first part of the package is you're saying we're going to actually be putting less of this stuff out to consumers and out to the environment than we were 10 years ago. Like, so that would be one big step.
So time bound.
Yeah, absolutely.
And specific with a numeric target.
Right.
Yep.
And so now everybody, all the companies can work to that target and again, get back to your level playing field point. Then there's something called a PRO, a packaging reduction organization, right? So you could have a body that is really funded by the private sector that's set up to do things like how do we get to, say, a 50% reduction in plastic packaging, right? Not every company is going to have the kind of R&D that they need to do that, right? So you sort of do some of that research work in common, right? And that can be shared through this PRO. You can have that PRO help set metrics for other kinds of plastic reduction that may become policy in the future, right? So they're doing research on that as we go. They're funding the development and the implementation of better reclamation technologies, right? So that could be municipal recycling systems. It could be making sure that there's not a lot of waste being lost in community waste streams, right? So all these things that companies, what we're talking about now is internalizing some of those externalities, right? Because waste plastic doesn't have a lot of value, we're actually imposing a cost and creating a value on that. This is the part of the producer responsibility part, where they're now actually saying, we're going to spend some of our money to try to address this fact that this has been externalized. We're going to bring it in. We're going to bring it internal to our operations, and we're going to pay for figuring out how to do that.
Yep.
Last thing is that accountability regulatory piece, right? We have state and federal agencies whose job it is, regardless of what you might be hearing these days, whose job it is to protect public health and the environment. Like that's US EPA's job. That's Illinois EPA's job. And so make sure those agencies have the authority they need to ensure that the other pieces of the EPR are actually working the way that they do, and that the progress, according to the metrics we all agreed on, is actually happening, right? And give them the legal authority to make sure that's happening. We've got, and again, back to that whole point about, big government, the reason that the Great Lakes are as clean as they are today, the reason you can look out on the Great Lakes in a lot of places and see that sort of endless water that looks fantastic, is because government agencies, starting with the passage of the Clean Water Act, did their jobs, and at the federal and state level, identified the contaminants of most concern for the Great Lakes and enforced the law, right? And they did that for decades, and the Great Lakes got cleaned up, right? I'm not old enough to have lived here back in the 50s and 60s when things got really, really bad.
Right.
I've seen pictures. I've talked to people who were there. The level of chemical contamination that was going on in the mid-20th century here is unimaginable today.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's a product of government agencies doing their jobs, enforcing the law, and companies internalizing the costs of controlling that pollution. We absolutely have experience with that. It's worked. We can do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're about to host swimming in the Chicago River.
I know. It's
it's amazing.
fantastic.
Yeah.
If I could swim more than like 100 feet, without gasping for air, I would do it. But I know a lot of people are excited about I can swim just fine, but I'm not a competitive swimmer.
Neither am I, but I want to get in that water.
And I want to see it. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to that day when like you can actually have a pier or a place where you can just step in or jump into the river and really appreciate how clean it's gotten compared to where we were 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah. I think the picture you're painting is that it's totally possible to have a beautiful natural environment, a clean city, healthy people, and a powerful economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
All at the same time.
Yeah.
That one doesn't have to be at the cost of the other. What I've understood also from EPR, that what helped me learn the concept, right? Extended producer responsibility, right? It's saying that if you are, let's call it a beverage company, and you produce a soda bottle, you kind of are responsible for that soda bottle. We're extending your responsibility, not just from buying that petroleum that then gets pelletized into plastic, that then gets blown into a bottle, that then gets filled at your bottling plant and then gets sold to a retailer.
Yeah.
Right now, it sort of ends at that retailer. Once your bottle gets off the back of a truck into that retailer storage unit, now that responsibility is the retailer's responsibility. And what EPR is saying is, hold on, bottling company, beverage brand, that's still your bottle. In some way, you have to be responsible for then what happens after that bottle enters the retailer, after it gets checked out by the consumer and taken home and consumed and thrown in the recycling bin or the trash bin, and then thrown into the landfill or maybe recycled, or ending up through the channels, the gaps that you've talked about on the lakefront. That's still your responsibility.
Right.
We're extending you, the producer, your responsibility through the entire life cycle of that product. But what's fun about that, if I understand correctly, the PRO, that is it's a fund, right? It's a cash like booty that everyone's going to throw into.
Yes.
Equivalent to their production. So if you're producer X and you're doing 1 million bottles a day, you're producing or selling 1 million bottles a day in Illinois, you're going to be responsible for 1 million. You're going to be responsible for 1 million bottles a day. The PRO will set what that price is. Is it?
Right. It can, yeah.
Right, it can. But it's the PRO's responsibility to say, if that's the rule that we're going to follow and we're going to set, then you, producer, are going to pay for those 1 million bottles. It might be 1/10 of a cent, whatever the right amount is. But you, mom and pop, that are producing 100 bottles a day, you'll only be responsible for those 100 bottles. It's trying to right size the responsibility, the fiscal responsibility, right, for the producer.
Yes, and it creates a choice for the producer, right? Because they don't have to be producing those 1 million bottles, right? They can make a choice about how they get their product to the consumer.
Right.
I think that's what, again, we're going back to like it creates the cost, so they're internalizing that cost, and then they have control over it, right? They might have a mandate where you have to reduce plastic packaging by X amount, and you might have a cost to you because of the amount of plastic that you're producing, and then you can choose to figure out, how am I going to get my product to consumers in a way that reduces my costs, keeps the consumer satisfied, and increases my profits, right? You can do all those things.
Yep.
But unless the incentive is there, like you've just described, of like the cost reduction and other incentives, then there's no reason to change practices. So yeah, I think you described it very well, the specifics of how that can work. And it will, I think, again, create an opportunity for a company to make a choice that they don't have to make right now about how they deliver their product in a way that can keep the plastic out of the environment and help reduce the amount that they're producing in the first place.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I think being here in the Midwest right now is a very exciting time for EPR, right? You mentioned Minnesota was the first Midwestern state to pass EPR. I know that Michigan and Illinois were considering it. We're kind of in the running.
And New York as well. So
fair if you're considering Great Lakes Extension.
Well, yes, we have to. Yes,
I love it.
I always remind people how big the Great Lakes are.
So New York, fair.
New
New
York
York has
1,000
already
miles wide. So yeah.
New York has passed EPR. And now we have here in the state of Illinois, I like to drum up a little bit of competitiveness. So here in the state of Illinois, we have a needs assessment going on, right? We passed a bill in the state that says now we're going to fund a research study to understand how we might in the state of Illinois structure our EPR. Right. So that was funded by federal EPA, granted Illinois EPA money to then begin this needs assessment. And that's going to run for 1 to 2 years, I believe.
I think so, yeah.
And then they'll make a proposal of how we should structure our EPR regulations, right? So I'm curious if you have thoughts or advice for listeners out there of what is a way that an individual can get involved or help encourage the state of Illinois to move forward on this EPR program?
Yeah, I think that it's important, as we learned when we were working on the potential styrofoam ban, which ultimately didn't pass in Illinois. It's really critical that your state legislators and agencies are hearing from you. Again, it's easy to get cynical about politics right now, but if this is an important issue to you, it's really important that you reach out to your elected officials that are representing you and helping them understand that this is a priority. In this case, the whole idea here is that the state has sort of given itself time to be able to research the implications of EPR, structure it in a way that they will propose will make sense for the state of Illinois, and then come back to the table in the General Assembly and see if the state actually wants to run with a potential policy. So it's not obviously getting the whole thing done right now, but it is a good step.
Yep.
I do encourage people to think about, when they're thinking about plastics, it's not just about the particles in the water. It's not just about the fact that this is being manufactured from oil we're pulling out of the ground, and adding to the climate change problem. It's not just about the water bottle they might see on the beach or the cigarette, but it's about all of those things and more. It's the people that are living near the facilities where plastic is being produced,
right? Recycled
and like the waste collection facilities, and it is about the chemicals that actually bind themselves to particles of plastic and recirculate within our environment and within our bodies. It's a massive, again, we come back to that word systemic issue, right? And so I just encourage people to find the way that plastic connects with them, that the problem connects with them, and make sure you're sharing that with the people that represent you, in this case in Illinois, in Springfield, in the governor's office, and just making sure that that's known. But there's a lot of ways that people are impacted by this issue. And it's important that our elected officials hear about that.
Yeah, and I want to add here, I was not very involved at all in this kind of governmental democracy process until a couple of weeks ago when I started really digging into the Illinois EPR. You can Google, based on your zip code, who is your state rep or state senator. They've got, their website has a phone number, email address. You can find from various green organizations language that you can use, or you can just write them and say, hey, I really care about EPR.
Yeah.
Can you make sure that this goes forward? You can dial their phone number. Someone will pick up. They will take your name and address down and phone number, and they will pass your comment on to your representative. It takes 5 minutes. It's actually I think it feels overwhelming and scary and foreboding when you've never done it, but it's really easy to do. And if you have never engaged with an elected official before, I can tell you that if a representative gets 10 phone calls or 10 personalized letters, whether it's, not a lot of people write on paper anymore, but emails, as long as they're personal, they're not form emails. If they get 10 of those about one issue from people who live in their district, you identify yourself, as a voter in that district, they do pay attention,
right? It really does get across. And so I just want to encourage, again, find the way that you connect to this topic, write a personal note or make that phone call and talk about why you're personally invested in the solution, and your elected officials will pay attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got to talk a little bit about public advocacy.
Yeah.
And we've talked a little bit about volunteerism, but we'd love to hear a little more from you about your Adopt a Beach activities and how others might be able to get involved.
Yeah, well, I have a couple opportunities I can share. Our Adopt a Beach program covers the entire Great Lakes, and we typically have any given year around 10,000 volunteers over the course of the year going out to hundreds of cleanup events all across the Great Lakes. So if somebody wants to get involved with that, of course, they can go to our website, greatlakes.org. It's easy to find. They can sign up for a public event that's already planned, or they can get together with friends or a community group or whoever they want to organize with and set up a event for themselves. Very easy to do. And so I encourage people to get involved in Adopt a Beach. It gives you that sort of firsthand look at what's actually on the ground, getting into the water from the land, and you can be part of that data collection to show how much plastic there is out there.
Yeah, I'll say I signed up. It's
awesome.
Super
Thank
easy.
You.
Yeah, it's super easy. The website, you can search by location, date, time.
I'm so glad to hear it works. That's great.
It worked very well. I was able to narrow it down based on where I live, what's most convenient, and then also what hours I'm available.
Yeah.
And sign up, and I'm going to show up.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it. And another opportunity that's out there, if you really want to get more into the issue side of things, we have a program called the Alliance Ambassadors. And so Ambassadors is our effort to give people more detail about Great Lakes issues. So people attend a sort of an intro general training about all the issues that the Alliance works on. And then you can kind of pick and choose to do deep dives based on your interests. So our staff and our sort of experts that we work with outside the Alliance come together and actually provide trainings about what's going on. For example, if you want to really learn the ins and outs of EPR, you want to maybe lead advocacy on that to your decision makers. You want to be able to talk about it in your community. We give you the tools to do that. And that's another volunteer program that people can get involved with and get to know, the issue of plastics or anything else we work on in much more depth.
Amazing. And I'll say, because humans really are social creatures and we get influenced by what others are doing, since the start of your Adopt a Beach cleanup program, you've had over 200,000 volunteers participate, remove almost 10 million individual pieces of
We've
litter.
Actually passed 10 million this year.
Awesome. Yes. Okay. And removed over 500,000 pounds of litter from the shoreline, which is just incredible.
I try, I try really hard in general to minimize the amount of plastic packaging that I consume in the first place. And I think that's a great place for people to start. It's good. I put all that stuff in the recycling bin. I know that a lot of it doesn't ultimately get reused. And so what I try to do is to make sure that I'm just buying as little plastic waste as possible. And unfortunately, a lot of plastic, especially associated with food, it's designed to be thrown out. And I'll mention that we're working on getting a new expert panel set up at the Alliance. One of the things we rely on is scientists and experts outside of our organization who are just passionate about the issues. And plastics is such a burgeoning area of research. There's a lot of academics and researchers who want to engage on this. And so we're going to be doing some work to organize them and making sure that their expertise is guiding us towards smart policies like EPR and other things.
Amazing. Just to give people some ideas of how they might reduce their plastic packaging, maybe we can rattle off. I have one idea, which is try to go to a farmer's market one time this month and bring your own cloth bags, reusable.
Canvas, throw it all in there. You don't need the individual little plastic bags at the grocery store.
Yeah. Maybe next time you're at the supermarket, just say ask to speak to the manager and say, hey, could we, it's important for me as a consumer to reduce the plastic. Again, I think people respond. If they hear a message 3 times, 4 times, it becomes it's a bee in their own bonnet that they want to turn around now and figure out.
I'm sure it frustrates people sometimes at the grocery store because I'm the person who will grab a handful of stuff out of the produce and not put it in a bag, and then I just put it right on the conveyor. The conveyor because I'm I don't need these 3 like bulbs of garlic to be in a plastic bag, right?
Yeah.
So the little stuff like that. Again, be mindful around you of like what plastic you're grabbing, because it is going to get thrown out. And then recognize that you alone aren't going to be able to solve that problem, right?
Yeah.
Got to get to these sort of systemic solutions.
Awesome. All right, we're going into rapid fire.
All right.
So to begin with, what's the most surprising item you've ever seen washed up on a Great Lakes beach?
Well, whether it was washed up or not, I do have a picture of a young man holding a microwave, which was sort of, I can't imagine that washed up, but it was there. And so I'll go with microwave.
Awesome. What's your favorite Great Lake and why? And you can choose. We won't tell the others.
Yeah, I'm not supposed to choose. At this point, I have to say Lake Michigan. I've now lived near Lake Michigan for the most years of my life of any other Great Lake. Spent a lot of time with my own family on Lake Michigan and just love it. And I'm on the lakefront path here in Chicago all the time. But they are all wonderful, right? I mean, and I would encourage,
like picking your favorite child.
It is, and I haven't swum in Lake Ontario yet. I've swum in the other 4. So
okay.
I feel like I've got a gap there, and I want to encourage people pay attention to Lake Superior, because it is their most remote, hardest to get to, but it's also just stunningly beautiful, and it's very different than the other Great Lakes.
Okay, that's one of my goals for this summer.
Yeah.
If you had 30 seconds with every state lawmaker in the Great Lakes region, what would you say?
Everybody in the Great Lakes region deserves to have safe and clean drinking water, and our Great Lakes need to be protected for people who live here today and for everybody who's going to be here generations from now.
Amazing. 2 more quick ones.
Sure.
What makes the Great Lakes so uniquely vulnerable?
They are working lakes, right? So these aren't places where we have just set them aside and said, we're going to keep them pristine and we're going to, sort of let them be totally natural. They've had 150 years of work done on them. Maritime commerce, steel production, oil refining, auto production, and they serve as our drinking water source and the hub of our economy, right? So you pack all that in to what is a big place, 1,000 miles across roughly. It starts to feel a lot smaller because they are very vulnerable to all those different uses, all that work that happens here in the Great Lakes, and we still have to depend on them for our own health, for our own drinking water. So I think that's the part that kind of keeps me focused on what our region needs to live up to.
Amazing. I think we should end there. That's very uplifting, exciting, hopeful. Joel, thank you for joining us and for just articulating such complicated ideas in clear, logical, obvious ways. And so I hope everyone out there is also feeling really inspired. Call up your local representative, make a comment to retailer, sign up for a beach cleanup. Easy things right here available at your fingertips to make an impact today. Thanks for listening to Unbottled. If this episode got you thinking about plastic, systems change, or how we build a better future, don't just be a listener, be an owner. Kadeya is raising a community round on WeFunder, and that means you can invest as little as $100 and help us bring closed-loop beverage systems to more people in more places. Because real change doesn't happen alone, and the future of hydration needs all of us. Learn more and join our investor community at wefunder.com/Kadeya. That's Kadeya. The link is also in the show notes. Let's build it together.